Well, usually when you fill out a form, say at the DMV or a consulate, there is this expectation of mundane precision.
Right. Just checking boxes.
Exactly. You write down your name, your date of birth, your address. You are essentially engaging with the machine. It's dry, it's boring, and it's totally bureaucratic. But imagine you were traveling to a new country.
Okay.
You step up to the desk, you pull out your pen, and the official form asks you in complete deadpan, are you an anarchist?
I mean, it completely breaks the brain's bureaucratic autopilot, right?
Yeah.
You expect to be asked about, your vaccinations or your visa status, not your fundamental political philosophy regarding the existence of the state.
Right. And it doesn't even stop there because the very next question on this historical document asks, are you a polygamist?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So suddenly that boring administrative machine is just entirely broken. You aren't just looking at a legal document anymore. You are looking at a deeply weird moral and, frankly, philosophical inquisition.
Which is exactly the kind of thing we love to unpack here.
It is. And we love those kinds of weird philosophical moments here at Under the Hood. We are coming to you, broadcasting directly from the little station on Commercial Street in Atchison, Kansas, bringing you another thoughtful literary and cultural deep dive for Chesterton Radio. And today, we are going under the hood of a book written by a man who was handed that exact bizarre questionnaire back in 1921.
Yeah. The book is called What I Saw in America. And it was published in 1922, just following his really extensive tour of the United States.
So, before we go any further, consider this your official spoiler warning. We are going to dissect the core arguments, the biggest surprises, and, well, the profound conclusions of this book. If you haven't read it yet, we highly encourage you to go read the text. You can easily find it on Project Gutenberg, actually.
Yeah, it's all in the public domain.
Exactly. So go read it and then come back and join us, because our mission today is not just to give you a chapter summary. That's not what we do.
No, definitely not.
We want to discover what this author was really seeing beneath the surface of the American experiment, and why his century-old observations about cities and business and democracy and even public fads, why they remain shockingly relevant to us today.
And to do that justice, we really have to talk about the observer himself, Gilbert Keith Chesterton.
G.K. Chesterton. For those of you listening who might be new to his work, you kind of have to picture the physical presence of the man first. He stood 6'4" and weighed around 300 pounds.
The literal giant.
The literal giant. And he was famously, almost pathologically absent-minded.
Oh, the stories are amazing.
Right. There's that wonderful legend that he once sent a telegram to his wife saying, "Am in Market Harborough. Where ought I to be?"
Which is just incredible. He had no idea where he was supposed to be going.
None. He just wandered around London in this flowing cape and a crumpled slouch hat clutching a sword stick. And he was often just bursting into laughter at his own private jokes on the street.
But, beneath that highly eccentric, almost comical exterior, he was arguably the most formidable writer and thinker of the early 20th century. He was an absolute English genius, a Catholic convert, and a man who publicly and very joyfully debated the intellectual giants of his era.
People like George Bernard Shaw, right?
Yeah, Shaw, H.G. Wells, Clarence Darrow. He took them all on.
And he wrote, something like 4,000 newspaper essays during his lifetime?
At least, alongside dozens of books, poems, the Father Brown detective stories.
He's just this tireless, fiercely articulate defender of the common man and of common sense. So when he visited the United States in 1921, he brought that immense intellect and his deeply Catholic incarnational worldview right along with him.
He did. But to understand what Chesterton actually saw in America, we first have to understand how he looked at it.
Yes, the methodology.
Right. Because he kicks off this entire book with a philosophy of travel that completely inverts how we normally think about tourism. He makes this really bold claim that travel narrows the mind.
Which sounds completely backwards to us.
Totally backwards. We spend our whole lives hearing the exact opposite. We are told that travel broadens the mind, that you have to pack your bags and go see the world to truly understand humanity. But Chesterton just flips that on its head.
So how does he justify that?
Well, he argues that a thoughtful, imaginative person might have just stayed home in England, sitting by the fire, loving Laplanders, and embracing Chinamen in his heart.
Just through imagination and empathy.
Exactly. From the comfort of his armchair, he can understand their shared, fundamental human struggles. Because he knows that across the globe, people labor, they love their children, they fear death, they seek meaning. That shared human bond is the inner reality.
But then he says, you actually buy a ticket.
Right. You buy the ticket, you cross the ocean. And for Chesterton, to travel is to leave the inside and draw dangerously near the outside. By going to look at unfamiliar manners and customs, you are basically inviting foreigners to disguise themselves in fantastic masks and costumes.
So you just end up staring at the superficial differences.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if you only look at those surface elements, your mind actually shrinks. You lose that beautiful, abstract brotherhood of man, and you replace it with a fixation on like how weird their hats are, or how strange their food tastes, or how loudly they speak.
Chesterton even brings up that old euphemism, right, where a meeting meant a duel with swords.
Yes, because physical proximity highlights our friction points. When people of different nationalities actually meet in the flesh, that is the moment of supreme danger.
Okay, so if travel inherently risks narrowing the mind by focusing on these superficial differences, I have to ask how Chesterton attempted to, hack his own trip.
Hack it.
Because it's like visiting a massive cultural festival just to look at the colorful costumes and completely missing the actual human beings sweating inside them.
Yeah.
So how did he ensure he learned something real and didn't just stare at the masks?
Well, he established 2 firm rules for himself before he even stepped off the boat in New York. First, he decided that nobody should be ashamed of thinking a thing is funny because it is foreign.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's okay to laugh.
Yeah, it's a completely natural, healthy human reaction to chuckle at something that's utterly unfamiliar. But the second rule is the real anchor here. You must be absolutely ashamed of thinking a thing is wrong or inferior just because it is funny.
So mere unfamiliarity does not equal inferiority.
Exactly. That is the trap of the bad tourist.
Which brings us right back to that passport form at the American consulate.
Right. So he is handed this paper asking if he is an anarchist or a polygamist. Now, the typical narrow-minded English tourist of 1921 would just laugh at American bureaucratic stupidity. They'd write a snarky letter to the Times about the colonies and just walk away feeling vastly superior.
Just writing it off as a joke.
But Chesterton refuses to do that.
Yeah.
Because of his rules, he insists we must find the explanation behind the joke. What is the inner reality that makes America ask a question that would never, ever appear on a French or British passport application?
Let me see if I can put an analogy to this. If I invite an old friend from my hometown to a weekend party, I don't worry he's going to blow up my house.
Right, of course not.
I know his habits, I know his background, but if I invite someone from the absolute edges of the globe, and Chesterton uses terms common to his era, like the interior of Kamchatka or the Harianu of Japan, to represent the farthest reaches of human diversity. If I invite them, I might genuinely want to know if their specific cultural or religious background requires human sacrifice.
Yeah, you don't know the baseline.
I don't know the baseline at all. So by seeking the reason behind those bizarre passport questions, Chesterton arrives at his defining thesis about the United States.
He realizes that America is not just a geographical place, it is an idea. He famously writes that America is a nation with the soul of a church.
A nation with the soul of a church. I mean, that is a massive, heavy phrase.
It really is. And he means it quite literally in terms of its structural foundation. America, he observed, is the only nation on earth founded on a creed. And that creed is laid out explicitly, dogmatically, in the Declaration of Independence.
The idea that all men are created equal.
Exactly. When we talk about America as a melting pot, we almost always focus on the melting pot, right?
Yeah, the blending of all the cultures.
But Chesterton points out that the metaphor of a melting pot implies a pot of a certain shape and a solid substance. The pot itself cannot melt.
Oh, that's good. The pot is the Jeffersonian democratic ideal. It is the unyielding container that actually holds all the chaos together.
And the ambition to take anyone, whether that's a Russian peasant, an Irish immigrant, or someone from the farthest corners of the earth, and Americanize them, is a fundamentally religious ambition. It is not a racial ambition. America invites all men to become citizens, but it demands a dogmatic belief in the concept of citizenship itself. You have to assent to the creed.
I have to push back on this a little bit, though, on behalf of our listener, because looking at it from our modern perspective, this sounds highly problematic.
Oh,
Well, if America is essentially a church with a specific democratic dogma, doesn't that inherently breed a new kind of inquisition? Aren't we basically forced to exclude those who don't believe the creed? I mean, asking someone, "Are you an anarchist?" isn't just a quirky border question. It's basically a heresy trial at the border. You are literally policing thought.
that is precisely the point Chesterton is making. And framing it as an inquisition is entirely historically accurate to him. He actually compares the American border policy to the Spanish Inquisition.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Now, the Spanish Inquisition might have been extraordinarily narrow regarding theology, but it was incredibly broad regarding ethnology. They might burn a brilliant philosopher at the stake for being a heretic, but they would happily welcome a barbarian into the fold as long as he was orthodox in his belief.
Okay, so it's entirely about belief, not bloodlines.
Exactly. And that is a massive distinction in human history. It is the defining distinction for America. And we can really see Chesterton's own Catholic worldview bleeding into this analysis here. The Catholic Church famously excludes neither Jew nor Greek. It transcends race and nationality, but it substitutes a specific, rigorous philosophy.
So America operates the exact same way.
It does. It protects itself through ideological selection, not racial selection. The religious missionary can condemn a cannibal for his actions because he cannot condemn him for his race. And the American border agent excludes the anarchist or the polygamist because he cannot exclude the Turk or the Kamchatkan just for being from somewhere else.
That reframes the American dogma of equality completely for me. It isn't just some fairy tale assertion that all men are equally tall or equally smart or even equally virtuous because, every child knows that is blatantly false.
Right? Nobody believes that. The American creed is an absolute moral value. It is the theological assertion that every human being has an invariable, indestructible dignity given to them by their Creator. And to maintain a cosmopolitan commonwealth made out of vagabonds and refugees and exiles from every nation on earth, you have to be utterly dogmatic about that dignity. Otherwise, the melting pot just shatters under the pressure of its own diversity.
That makes so much sense. So if we move from this grand abstract idea of American equality to how it actually manifests physically, we really get to see Chesterton's incredible eye for detail because he starts examining the everyday spaces where Americans gather. He looks at basically the architecture of equality.
Yes, and when Chesterton looked at the American hotel, he saw something profoundly symbolic. He noted that the American hotel is not America, but it is deeply, inextricably American.
To explain this to the listener, I think we have to bring up Walt Whitman for a second.
Oh, absolutely.
Because Whitman is essentially the great American poet of democracy from the 19th century. He wrote in these sweeping free verse lists celebrating the common man, the laborer, the vastness of the American continent. And Chesterton brings Whitman up and talks about how American hotels tend toward this massive, almost staggering uniformity. He envisions Whitman singing a lyric litany of optimism to 999 identical bathrooms.
It's such a funny image, but it's true. The scale of American architecture in the 1920s was completely baffling to an Englishman who was used to quirky, centuries-old inns where every room is a different shape.
Yeah, where nothing matches.
Right. But Chesterton warns us not to sneer at that uniformity. He sees that this physical repetition actually disguises a natural civic dignity. He points out that the ancient Romans boasted of being a nation of kings, and if you walk around in a nation of kings, you might eventually get tired of seeing a crowd where every single man has the exact same gold crown and the exact same ivory scepter.
Right, but the point is, they all have crowns. It's like a massive hive where every bee is treated with the exact same baseline respect. It's undeniably beautiful in its egalitarian promise, but you have to admit it's also terrifying in its endless mass-produced repetition.
It is. But the ultimate symbol of this civic equality, in Chesterton's eyes, was what he jokingly called the cult of the elevator.
I absolutely love this imagery. He comes to America, he rides up to his hotel room, and he basically suspects we've invented a new secret religion where we worship in tiny flying chapels.
Yeah, he unpacks it starting with the language itself, which is so smart. In England, they call it a lift. The word is quick, it's efficient, it's functional, does exactly what it says.
Very utilitarian.
But in America, it's an elevator. It's a long, ceremonious, multisyllabic word. Chesterton argues that there is a delay in the diction that suggests a vague but idealistic religion. And then he watches how American men behave inside these boxes. A man won't take his hat off in a crowded hotel lobby, but the moment he steps into the elevator with a lady, the hat immediately comes off.
So he uncovers this behavior in this tiny temple. The elevator transforms from just a mechanical box into a sacred space of civic duty.
Exactly. And this specific observation reveals a massive societal shift. It shows a society that fundamentally lacks English aristocratic snobbery. In England, the cultural ideal revolves around the concept of the gentleman. It's a class distinction. But in America, the ideal revolves entirely around the citizen. The massive hotel lobby, the soaring elevator, these are spaces of shared civic dignity. They are built for everyone.
He doesn't just romanticize this architectural equality, though, does he? He issues a very stark warning about its fragility in the book.
He does. He sees that this civic ideal of equality is currently besieged by the insane inequalities of modern industrial capitalism. Citizenship is the stated ideal, yes, but plutocracy, the raw rule of the wealthy, is the grim reality that is threatening to beat that beautiful ideal shapeless.
That tension between the civic ideal and the reality of capitalism completely changes flavor once you step out of the elevator and into the boardroom.
Oh, totally.
Because Chesterton noticed that while Americans treat each other as civic equals, their real operative religion is the hustle. We really have to look at his fascinating breakdown of the romance of business.
He offers a brilliantly sharp observation about the difference between English and American businessmen. If you put two prosperous English businessmen on a train carriage together, what are they going to talk about?
Probably the weather.
Or their holidays. They will talk about hunting, or their gardens, or their leisure time. In England, the ultimate cultural ideal is not labor, it's leisure. The goal is to build a country gentleman who has enough inherited money or accumulated wealth to completely forget about money. But if you put two American businessmen on a train, they will inevitably talk about work.
So in America, business isn't just a means to an end, it is a romance. It is literally a religion in itself.
Chesterton notes that in the American lexicon, the phrase making good carries a deep ethical, almost moral echo. It's akin to the old sense of chivalric honor in dueling days. An American feels that making good in business makes him worthy of self-respect, worthy of his community, and worthy of those he loves.
But let's be honest about the dark side of that romantic idealism, because Chesterton points out that this romance actually excuses some incredibly terrible behavior.
It really does.
A man might be swindling his partners, lying to the public, and just grinding the faces of the poor, but as long as he ultimately makes good and builds the skyscraper or secures the monopoly, the culture largely forgives him. Why? Because he achieved the romantic ideal. It's basically a fanaticism that blinds people to basic morality.
And this romantic intensity leads to a wonderful, completely counterintuitive paradox that Chesterton uncovers about American hustle culture. We typically think of Americans as constantly hustling, haggling, and just obsessed with hyper-efficiency. But Chesterton noticed that the hustling American businessman is almost always late.
The imagery he uses here is so vivid. He says he spent his entire life in England getting used to being the most unbusinesslike, disorganized person in any given room. Suddenly, he arrives in America, he shows up to his own lectures exactly on time, and the entire American audience, these titans of industry and hustle, are an hour late.
He traces this back to the root motivation. American unpunctuality stems from the fact that they are fundamentally impulsive, not punctilious. They do not run their lives by the clock like a set of rigid bureaucratic English rules. Because business is a grand romance to them, it involves not just rushing from point A to point B, but lingering in the thrill of a new idea.
He paints this hilarious picture of an American businessman's itinerary. Let's say this guy has 3 meetings scheduled. First, he is overseeing the building of a 20-story tower. Second, he is discussing printing advertisements on restaurant napkins. Third, he has a massive conference on chewing gum.
Right. And right in the middle of the napkin meeting, this businessman suddenly looks at the waiter standing nearby, and he gets a rapturous, visionary idea about advertising Gee Whiz Ginger Champagne directly on the waiter's crisp white shirt front.
Like a walking billboard.
Exactly. And he will launch into a massive, impassioned monologue exploring this brand new idea, completely ignoring his watch, ignoring his schedule, and ultimately show up totally late for the chewing gum conference.
I want to ask you, the listener, to map this onto our world today. Just look at modern startup founders, the Silicon Valley ethos, and internet hustle culture influencers. Are they just the modern inheritors of this exact same romantic delusion that Chesterton saw a century ago? I mean, when you see someone on social media grinding at 4:00 a.m., boasting about their lack of sleep to build an app that frankly does nothing of real societal value, is that the Gee Whiz Ginger Champagne of our time?
I think the parallel is stunning. Chesterton explicitly calls this American business mindset a delusion of fairy gold. They are building castles in the sky, they're trading in concepts and speculative futures that don't even physically exist. But it fills their imaginations with poetic fire.
They are, at their core, romantic salespeople.
Yes, they aren't living in the grounded reality of the English gentleman farmer. They're living in poetry, even if it happens to be the poetry of pork packing or app building.
The poetry of pork packing? That is incredible. Now, the romance and hustle of American business bleed perfectly into the business of American truth-telling. Which brings us to journalism. You would think that an aristocratic literary Englishman would be absolutely horrified by the brash, invasive, sensationalist American press.
You would, and it's actually one of the biggest surprises of the book. Chesterton mounts a really strong defense of the American interviewer. He calls them polite artists. He acknowledges the stereotype, yes, they hustle into your hotel room uninvited, but he highlights the crucial redeeming factor. They also hustle out.
Unlike polite Englishmen who will just sit in your parlor, drink your tea, and just do not know how to end a conversation.
Lingering awkwardly forever because they are too polite to exit.
Exactly.
But on a much more profound level, Chesterton saw the American interviewers as essential translators of culture. When Chesterton was cornered by the press in New York or Chicago, he would give these highly complex, nuanced, philosophically dense English answers. For example, he gave a lengthy explanation about how prohibition was fundamentally a plutocratic tool used by the rich to control the laboring poor. The interviewer scribbled it down and translated it in the next morning's paper to prohibition, all matter of $sign.
I mean, to an Oxford-educated Englishman, that sounds completely crass. It sounds like they butchered his beautiful prose.
It does. But Chesterton realized it was an incredibly accurate, vital translation. The American journalist understood the core truth of his argument, that it was entirely about money and class warfare, better than a polite, deferential English journalist ever would have. When Chesterton went on a long tangent calling Walt Whitman a genius of the democratic spirit, the paper printed, "You're one real, red-blooded man."
The journalist is taking the English idiom and translating it flawlessly into the American vernacular.
Okay, I have to challenge this framing,
Hmm.
because Chesterton seems incredibly, almost dangerously forgiving of the press here. Isn't he ignoring the fact that translating nuance into sensational, bite-sized copy actively destroys public discourse?
Well,
I mean, he tells a story in the book about giving a nuanced philosophical talk about labor, and the paper runs a massive inflammatory headline. Chesterton takes sides in trolley strike. He didn't even know what a trolley strike was. How can he defend a system that literally invents conflict for clicks? That is a very fair critique. And Chesterton actually addresses it by making a vital distinction between the interviewer working the street and the headline writer back at the editorial desk. The interviewer is a rational pressman out in the world, making true cultural translations based on human interaction. The headline writer, however, according to Chesterton, is a completely different species.
how does he describe them?
He describes the headline writer as a solitary and savage cynic, locked in a room, divorced from reality, hating all mankind, and just raging at random to sell papers.
So they were the original clickbait creator of 1921, just sitting in a dark room trying to figure out what combination of words will make people angriest.
Pretty much. But to understand why Chesterton tolerates this, we have to look at his broader philosophy of how to judge a nation. He had a rule. You must see a nation as a balance, not a tendency. If a nation was only a tendency, like a pure tendency toward sensationalist lying, it would quickly destroy itself. But in every healthy nation, the national antidote always grows right next to the national poison.
So, if the sensational, cynical headlines are the poison, what on earth is the antidote?
The antidote is the American public's widespread, cynical awareness of it.
Ah, so they know it's garbage.
Exactly. Chesterton noted that the American press is vastly freer, louder, and more invasive than the English press. And precisely because of that, the American public is much more familiar with corruption and much more openly discusses the flaws of their own leaders. The English might have more polite, respectable newspapers, but as a result, they suffer from a cowardly, opaque political system where the state itself becomes a state secret. The sensationalism is the messy, loud price of transparency.
This hyper-focus on public morality and the loud, overarching power of public opinion leads directly to what Chesterton viewed as America's greatest internal threat. It wasn't foreign invasion. It was the tyranny of the fad. And the ultimate glaring example of this during his 1921 visit was prohibition.
Chesterton fiercely hated prohibition. And yes, he was a man who heartily enjoyed his wine and ale, but his hatred wasn't merely based on personal appetite. He hated it because of what it revealed about class, power, and hypocrisy. He stated his observation with absolute bluntness. He said prohibition does not exist.
It didn't exist because the rich kept right on drinking. The speakeasies were absolutely full of politicians and plutocrats.
Right. It was a moral law designed exclusively to police the poor. It ensured that the working-class man who drove the cab stayed perfectly sober and productive, while the rich passenger in the back seat could afford the bootlegger and get thoroughly drunk. Chesterton viewed this as a direct, violent violation of the natural rights of man that were supposed to be protected by the Jeffersonian creed.
He saw it as a terrifying, slippery slope. Right. He warned that if a state assumes the power to police what a man drinks in his own home, it can inevitably police whether he smokes in the open air. It could punish people for kissing. He even reached back into history and said they might eventually bring back the scold's bridle, which was a medieval iron torture device locked onto the head to prevent a woman from speaking to, literally, police conversation itself.
He did, because for Chesterton, the real existential danger of democracy is not anarchy or rebellion. It is convention. It is the overwhelming weight of uniformity. He described American public opinion as a prairie fire that eats up everything in its path, leaving no room for individual dissent.
To illustrate this, he brings up the imprisonment of Eugene Debs. For our listeners who might not remember their high school history, Eugene Debs was a prominent American socialist, a political leader, and a vocal pacifist during World War I.
Yeah, a major figure.
Under the Espionage Act, the U.S. government essentially made it illegal to speak out against the draft or the war effort. Debs gave speech, stood by his pacifist principles, and the government locked him in a federal penitentiary. He actually ran for president from his prison cell.
Chesterton looks at the Debs case and compares it to England. In England, an eccentric pacifist aristocrat running his mouth during a war might be tolerated, or at least ignored, because the English deeply value individuality and eccentricity. But democracy is no respecter of persons. When the prairie fire of American public opinion decided that pacifism was un-American and dangerous to the collective effort, Debs was just crushed. The unified democratic weight of the majority simply locked him in a cage.
I really want you, the listener, to sit with this concept for a moment. Look at contemporary America. Strip away your political affiliations. Ignore whether you lean left or right. Just look at the mechanism itself. Is this prairie fire of public opinion identical to modern cancel culture?
Oh, that's a brilliant connection.
Whether it's a digital mob on the left destroying a career over an old tweet, or a mob on the right boycotting a brand into oblivion over an advertising campaign, are we still suffering from this exact same phenomenon? Are we, as Chesterton joked, psychologically capable of making a man a convict just for wearing a blue necktie if the majority suddenly decides blue neckties are evil?
The parallel to modern social media dynamics is chillingly accurate. And to fully understand the psychology behind this, we have to look at how Chesterton reframed what sociologists call the herd instinct. Chesterton rejected that term completely. He said comparing Americans to a stampede of cattle or a flock of sheep is incredibly insulting and fundamentally wrong because it assumes they are blonde, dumb, and mindless.
So why do they flock together?
Actually, Americans flock together and assimilate so quickly because they are intensely self-conscious and highly sensitive to criticism. They assimilate because they care deeply about what their fellow citizens think of them.
So it's not a mindless herd shuffling off a cliff. It's a hyper-aware community that desperately, fundamentally wants to belong to that creed we discussed earlier.
Exactly. When you desperately want to belong to the civic religion, when your entire identity is tied up in being a good citizen, you become terrified of being branded a heretic. The prairie fire is fueled by the fear of excommunication from the American ideal.
So how did a nation founded on these profoundly progressive, enlightened 18th century ideals of liberty fall prey to such regressive, puritanical laws like prohibition? How does a country that champions freedom simultaneously invent the machinery to police morality so ruthlessly?
That's a great question.
Chesterton answers this paradox by completely dismantling a myth that we still tell ourselves today: the myth of America's youth.
We hear it constantly, right? In political speeches and cultural commentary, we say America is a young nation, a bold experiment still in its infancy. Chesterton points out that this is a very sloppy, illogical, mixed metaphor. It's like saying a limited liability company will soon get its second teeth.
Right, a corporate association or a republic doesn't have a biological age like a human being. It doesn't grow from a toddler to an adult.
He highlights this bizarre contradiction in American technology at the time. America had the absolute latest, most cutting-edge inventions. He marveled at the telephones in New York, which worked absolute miracles, instantly connecting people across vast distances with crystal clarity. But at the same exact time, they completely neglected the last but one invention. The Postal Service was an absolute disaster. He noted that letters lingered for days, lost in the system, as if they were being delivered by pack mule in some wild village in the Pyrenees.
That technological paradox, embracing the absolute newest while letting the foundational infrastructure rot, is still remarkably true today. But his deeper point is about historical preservation. Chesterton argues that in many profound ways, America is incredibly old. It is more historic, even more archaeological than modern England.
Which is wild to think about.
how does he justify that? I mean, how on earth is a country with brand new skyscrapers and a history barely spanning a few centuries older than England, which has literal medieval castles and Roman ruins?
Because America perfectly preserves past epochs of human thought in an unbroken, isolated form. Let's look at the American colonies. We often idolize the Pilgrim Fathers of New England as brave champions of religious liberty fleeing oppression.
Right, the Thanksgiving myth.
Chesterton, analyzing the actual historical record, says that is historically illiterate. The Puritan movement was a struggle against religious toleration. When they set up the Massachusetts Bay Colony, their experiment was defined by harsh intolerance, strict moral policing, and inquisition.
The Salem witch trials being the most famous, bloody example of that exact impulse.
Exactly the point. The Puritans wanted the freedom to enforce their strict morality on everyone in their borders. But at the same exact time in American history, you had the Catholic Cavaliers in Maryland. In 1649, Maryland passed the Toleration Act, establishing the first true legal religious equality on earth, protecting Trinitarian Christians of all stripes. Chesterton argues that America has archaeologically preserved both of those 17th century souls perfectly. The intense inquisitorial moral policing of the Puritans and the egalitarian, rights-based liberty of the Cavaliers. Those two ancient epochs are still fighting a civil war in the American psyche.
It's like America is a high-tech smartphone. We have the best, most advanced hardware in the world, skyscrapers, internet, AI, but beneath the glowing glass screen, it is somehow still running a 17th century operating system. The hardware is hyper-modern, but the software is ancient.
That is a perfect analogy, and it explains the paradox of prohibition. It perfectly explains why you have a country that builds skyscrapers and wireless telegraphs, pushing the boundaries of human achievement, but still passes laws banning a glass of beer and policing private morality, just like a 17th century Puritan village elder. The soul of that old inquisitorial epoch is preserved here in America much better than it is in modern secular England.
Let's take all of this. The soul of a church, the massive architecture of equality, the fairy gold of business, the prairie fire of public opinion, and this ancient Puritan software running our modern hardware. And look at what it means for our relationship with the rest of the world. Because Chesterton argues that understanding this complexity is the only way to ensure the survival of democracy itself.
Because America is this deeply complex, ancient yet modern ideological project, Chesterton demands that England stop pretending the two nations are exactly the same. He had zero patience for the shallow, diplomatic Anglo-American propaganda of his day that claimed we were just one big, happy Anglo-Saxon family.
He says, trying to produce an Abraham Lincoln out of the materials of an English cathedral town is literally impossible. It's a category error. It's like wondering how a president could have a church spire, or how a church could have a chin beard. The raw materials of the cultures are fundamentally different.
We may speak the same language, superficially, but we do not share the same soul. Chesterton says that true international friendship requires treating the other country as a strange land. If you want to actually respect America, you have to look at its weirdness, its intensity, its dogmas, and say, with Shakespeare, and therefore, as a stranger, give it welcome.
You don't build real friendship by pretending fundamental differences don't exist or by smoothing over the rough edges. You build it by respecting the strange, unique dignity of the other. But he also lays out an ultimate existential test for this strange American democratic experiment.
He does, and it's a prophetic, terrifying final warning. Chesterton believed that the entire American system, the equality, the rights, the citizenship, relies strictly on the dogma of the divine origin of man. The Declaration of Independence says we are created equal, endowed by a creator with unalienable rights.
It's a supernatural claim, not a scientific one.
If you strip away the Christian or Catholic moral foundation regarding indestructible human dignity, democracy has absolutely no logical basis. If humans are just evolved animals, the product of blind materialistic forces, then they are demonstrably scientifically evolved unequal. Some are physically stronger. Some are intellectually smarter. Some are more ruthless.
Walk us through the philosophical math here. What happens if America loses that underlying moral dogma? If we replace created equal with survival of the fittest, how does the system collapse?
Chesterton maps out the causality brutally. If democracy loses the supernatural claim of human dignity, it will inevitably become wildly and wickedly undemocratic. The strong will realize they have no moral obligation to the weak. The rich, the plutocrats, will riot with a brutal indifference, hoarding resources because nature tells them they are the apex predators. And the wage slaves, the laborers, will sink into heathen slavery, accepting their subjugation, or they will seek relief in destructive nihilistic theories that tear the whole structure down. Capitalism without a moral check becomes tyranny.
Which feels entirely too close to home when we look at the massive wealth inequalities, the gig economy wage struggles, and the social despair of our current era. It raises a very tough question for all of us. Chesterton criticized the prosperous Englishmen of his day for suffering from the bad habit of contentment, a blind, cozy self-satisfaction that prevented them from seeing the rot in their own society. Is it possible that the American citizen today is suffering from that exact same fatal contentment? Are we so distracted by our high-tech toys, our social media dopamine hits, and our modern gee-whiz ginger champagne that we're losing the very dogma of human dignity that keeps the whole melting pot from shattering?
That is the ultimate question the book demands we ask ourselves. And it reveals why what I saw in America is not actually a travel book at all. It was never about the geography. It is a profound meditation on civilization. It's about the true nature of freedom, the absolute necessity of gratitude for human dignity, and the urgent defense of the permanent things against the tyranny of fleeting modern fads.
It's amazing how a man visiting for a few months in 1921 could hold up a mirror that reflects us so painfully and beautifully clearly in 2026. Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to mull over before we sign off. Chesterton feared the tyranny of the majority above almost all else. He feared the erasure of the individual by commercial uniformity and the terrifying speed of the prairie fire of public opinion.
He saw it starting with the physical uniformity of hotels and the sensationalism of daily newspapers.
If he saw the spark then, look at the inferno now. Did Chesterton inadvertently predict that the very technological tools of connection we built to spread the American creed, our global internet, our social media algorithms, our instant networks, would actually become the ultimate prairie fire? Have the tools we built to celebrate our individuality and connect us across borders become the very things that burn down our individual humanity, forcing us to conform to the mob?
It's a haunting conclusion. When everyone is forced to compete with each other on the exact same digital platforms, under the exact same algorithms, they end up copying each other out of survival. Personality becomes a common, featureless ideal. True eccentricity is punished by the algorithm.
And suddenly you're just filling out a form again. You are checking digital boxes, curating your profile, desperately trying to prove to the algorithm and the digital mob that you aren't an anarchist or whatever today's heresy is so they don't burn your life down.
We find ourselves right back at the consulate.
We are always back at the consulate. The bureaucratic, inquisitorial machine never stops asking its strange, heavy questions. There is always so much more to learn, and we're so glad you joined us for this deep dive into the permanent things. We invite you to support Chesterton Radio, become a part of Chesterton Radio World, and continue discovering forgotten books, classic radio dramas, and timeless ideas broadcasting right here from the little station on Commercial Street in Atchison, Kansas. Until next time, keep looking beneath the surface.